So there's still more fallout this week from Iran's downing of that U.S. drone, which may or may not have been over their airspace. Apparently we're hearing now that the Iranians gave the drone a couple of warnings before they shot it down to get out of their airspace, and I guess the Americans didn't respond. We're not really hearing too much about what the American pilot, or I guess controller, whatever they call them, the guys who pilot remotely the drones. I assume that they can hear communications because that would be necessary for air traffic control and stuff for the drones to be able to receive communications. So it would be interesting if we could actually hear that exchange. I don't know if I assume that the Iranians were speaking to him in English and not in Farsi, because that obviously wouldn't make sense. Now, additionally, we're also hearing that there was a P-8 Poseidon, which is basically a Boeing 737 used by the military, that was flying alongside this drone at the time that it was shot down. The Iranians claim that, hey, if we wanted to, we could have shot down the plane too, since they feel that that was also violating their airspace. However, we did not because, we didn't want to take lives, which is interesting because that's the same line that Trump used when he decided to call off that retaliation strike last Thursday, I believe it was, that the military was planning to carry out. So I find that interesting. I'm not sure if the Iranians are retroactively coming up with this story to kind of mirror Trump's reasoning, but it at least would make sense to me that the Iranians would, if they're trying to avoid further escalation, would not kill any American soldiers. And from what we're hearing from Pompeo, that seems to be the new red line. I've heard that a couple of times, that the red line now for Iran is, hey, don't kill any U.S. soldiers. Now, apparently, after Trump called off this kinetic strike, as they call it, we used to call them bombings back in the day, he asked for some new options that were non-lethal, which could be implemented as a response to the downing of the drone. And that apparently came this weekend in the form of cyber attacks on Iran. Now, we've heard really about cyber attacks going both ways, from Iran towards the U.S. and also from the U.S. towards Iran. We really only have confirmation right now, though, about the attacks on Iran, because both the U.S. and Iran seem to have admitted that they happened, even though Iran at first did deny it. They now are saying that, that whatever attacks that the U.S. may have carried out didn't affect us one bit, which, I wouldn't necessarily take the word for it. I would imagine that the U.S. has better hackers than the Iranians, although from what I've been hearing, the Iranians in the last few years have really stepped up their cyber game. Cyber attacks are something that are, I would imagine, are much lower budget than trying to build up a conventional military, so perhaps it's something that a small country like Iran could do. I wouldn't be surprised if North Korea had some decent cyber capabilities as well. And of course, Russia and China seem to be quite notorious when it comes to their cyber capabilities at this point, although we've never really seen them unleashed on anybody. We've never seen a war in this digital age that really has utilized any of those sorts of capabilities. But apparently, from the reports we're hearing, the cyber attacks directed at Iran were meant to cripple the missile control system of the IRGC, which seems like a pretty handy capability in the case in which the U.S. were ever to invade Iran. Now, interestingly, something I really can't figure out is that at this point, Iran still sounds quite bombastic. I don't know if they're trying to just push Trump to his limits so that they can keep prodding, and as Stalin said, you keep prodding as long as you feel flesh, and until you hit the bone. I'm not sure if the Iranians are just prodding him with the bayonet looking for bone and haven't found it yet, or if they've got some kind of a death wish, because if I were an Iranian right now, I would be very upset with my government, because even though they are, trying to stand up for themselves a little bit, and I don't necessarily think that the Iranians are being too aggressive if you were thinking of the U.S. and Iran as equals, but considering that the U.S. and Iran are not equals, that Iran is far weaker than the U.S., if I were an Iranian, I would want my government to prioritize the safety of its citizens above all else. And I think that answering Trump's brinksmanship game is not a smart idea, even though it's worked out well for them so far. They've been able to push Trump quite a bit. But to me, The real issue here is that they have everything to lose if they were actually to get into a war with the U.S., and they don't have that much to gain from this brinksmanship tactic. To me, if I were Iran, I would be focused most on trying to get around the president's bodyguards, or the intellectual vanguard of Pompeo and Bolton and all these guys who surround the president and try and push him in a more warlike direction. And I would try to go straight to Trump and speak to him directly, because I think that Trump has said many times, in fact he just said it today or yesterday, that he would be Iran's best friend if they just gave up the nukes. That's code for him saying, hey, I just want to make a deal with you guys too. I think Trump has made it abundantly clear over this past week that the last thing he wants is to go to war with Iran, because he knows that it would guarantee that he loses re-election. As I think Tucker Carlson put quite succinctly on his show, and I think that was a major factor in Trump not going to war. In fact, Pence this week, even on, I believe it was State of the Union with Jake Tapper, which, again, who watches those stupid Sunday shows? But I guess the Iranians probably have heard by now that Mike Pence said to Jake Tapper that they would be willing to meet with them, the U.S. would be willing to meet with the Iranians with no preconditions. And then, of course, he outlined it. He threw in a precondition. He said, well, they'd have to agree to completely denuclearize before we speak to them, which Tapper appropriately pointed out is a precondition, which I thought was a little funny. But I think that Trump probably would be willing to meet with them truly without any preconditions, and he, kind of wants to hammer out his own deal. I think he said that from the beginning with Iran, even when he threw out the Iran nuclear deal, which at this point, looking at the way things are going, I don't think it was very smart to throw out the Iran nuclear deal. Maybe if he wanted to save face with his base, he could have renegotiated it. But at this point, I think Trump really just wants to have his own deal. Just like with the whole throwing out NAFTA and renegotiating it. The JCPOA is just NAFTA, but with Trump's name on it. It's Trump NAFTA. It's not all that different. So when he comes up with his Trump Iran deal, I imagine that if he were to do that, it would look a lot like the Obama Iran deal, with maybe a couple of changes, but largely the same. Which means that the anti-Iran hawks in Washington and on talk radio probably won't be happy. Of course, I think probably your Limbaugh and Hannity types, they're a little more grifty. Well, Hannity's certainly the most grifty of anyone. They'll probably be okay with whatever sort of Iran deal Trump comes up with. But I would imagine your Mark Levins, your more principled anti-Iran folks who want to bomb Iran, they probably won't be happy with a deal that Trump comes up with. Of course, we're a long way from that right now. We're not even to talks yet, which is, to me, that's the space that needs to be watched most closely right now. Is look for any sort of inroads that Trump and the Iranians are able to make in sort of reaching each other, because there's that massive wall there of U.S. bureaucrats who are standing between the president and the Iranians, and are stifling any potential negotiations. And don't underestimate the power of the bureaucracy. We saw how with the North Korea negotiations, how that was sabotaged by John Bolton in the Hanoi summit. Trump was making great progress with the North Koreans until John Bolton handed the North Koreans a set of demands written by John Bolton, which was designed essentially to make the North Koreans quit the negotiations, which of course they did. And now Trump's trying to mend that damage with that quote-unquote excellent letter. I'm not sure what that means, but the excellent letter that he wrote to Kim Jong-un. I didn't know that you could send letters to North Korea. I'm not sure who delivers there. I guess maybe FedEx via China. Now, don't be fooled. The risk of war with Iran is not off the table yet. Trump is still receiving heavy pressure from his advisors that he needs to strike as soon as possible, because they want to strike while the iron is hot. And Pompeo and Bolton are overseas scheming with other Iran hawks in other countries against any efforts of peace that may or may not be made by this president. And frankly, I don't know how long he can hold out before he breaks and just goes ahead and does it. Because Pompeo this week is visiting both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. He's in Saudi Arabia today, I believe. And obviously he'll be speaking with the leaders of that country. He sat down with the king of Saudi Arabia, and I don't think that it's at all unlikely that they would be scheming about how to try and get the president more interested in a war with Iran. Same with Bolton in Israel this week. I'm sure that he'll be speaking with Netanyahu, who he's known for many years, about how they can try and get Trump to come around to the right side. Really, everybody involved in any potential conflict with Iran seems to want war, except for President Trump. The Israelis, the Saudi Arabians, all the Gulf monarchies, really, except for probably Qatar, they want to go to war with Iran. Iran seems to want pretty strongly to go to war with the U.S. for some ungodly reason. I don't know, but that's how they're acting. That's what they've said. They said, hey, we're prepared for a war. Come at me, bro. The only people who seem skeptical seem to be some folks in the military, like General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who understands that, hey, invading Iran would be a disaster, it would be very difficult, and we'd lose a lot of lives. And then the second person is, of course, President Trump himself. Everybody else seems pretty pro-war. It's a pretty strong consensus. There's only a couple of outliers, and it just so happens that those two outliers are rather important gentlemen in this whole scenario. And don't forget that I think my prediction about next summer is still very much in play. I think that our economy is going to have some significant troubles in the months ahead. We'll see after the G20 summit what happens with the market, but things, needless to say, will not be going particularly well around the time of the election, and the president may just then finally be able to be convinced that a war with Iran is what he needs to win. And then we could still see something happen there. But in the near term and the long term, there are great risks. So I hope you folks stay tuned, and I'll try and follow all this as closely as I can. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you back here in the next one.